We're going to look at a few planting strategies to consider. And so if you already have a shoreline buffer in place in a fairly new area, the first thing to consider is editing. And that basically means using existing vegetation, but just trim or remove trees and shrubs as needed to allow yourself to have a view, such as this framed view in this picture. And again, you can make the trees be part of the landscape, part of the view. It's part of how this looks. This house wouldn't look so interesting if it were just all cleared off. Also, when you're out on the boat from the lake, you'll have more of the feel of being in a wooded area or an up north feel than if the banks are devoid of vegetation. The next one is no mow, let it grow. And this is what real cheap thing to do, real easy to do, is you just stop mowing. You put the mower away, at least for this part. And this works best in the area that's the wet fringe area or the wet mesic area. And a lot of times that's hard to mow anyway. So we encourage people to stop mowing that area and see what happens. A lot of times there's a seed bank in the bank area that those seeds are just waiting to germinate and allowed to come up. Sometimes they may come up from rooted structures as well. They're lying dormant, just waiting. We found very interesting flowering plants, sedges, grasses, just ready to go in some of these areas and in some locations. This doesn't necessarily work as well in the upland area because a lot of times the grasses that are brought in, the cultivar grasses, compete too much with the plants. But in the wet area, this seems to work pretty well. Another strategy is if you've already got some vegetation growing, but maybe it's sparse, maybe you want to add diversity, some color, some layers, you can just add plants. What I mean by adding layers is if you have just all grass, maybe a few flowers, you want to add some shrubs or some trees. And the reason for that's important is the wildlife like that. Wildlife prefer to have different heights and levels and different kinds of plants. They like the diversity. And it also adds interest to your landscape as well. And then the last one is the total revegetation. So this is for an area where you're having a lot of sod and want to improve your shoreline and put a buffer in, a filter strip in. So you might need to do a total revegetation. And I'm going to go over that a little bit more here in the next examples that I have. This one is my first example. This is common in Minnesota where we've got riprap or rock riprap that's been around for quite a long time. It's getting harder now in some places to get permits to be able to put in rock riprap. But one of the strategies we have is places where there is riprap already is we add plants to it. Sometimes there have been, if the rock has been there for a long time, this might be an area where the soil has started to come in and fill in. Maybe the waves have come up high enough where it's deposited some sand here, or there's been some soil that's either come in through the wind or come in from soil up above. If you have that, you might have pockets of soil that you can plant right into in the rock. Otherwise, you can take, and sometimes just moving the rock around a little bit, you can plant plants into the soil that would be below the rock. And here's what this site looked like 1 year after it was planted. You can see it's really softened the edges, and before long you won't even notice that there's much rock there. There may be some rocks exposed here and there, but it's not so stark and sterile looking as it was originally. So here's one that's where we did a total revegetation on this particular site up in Rush Lake near Cross Lake, Minnesota. Basically the area was marked off that was going to be planted, and the sod that was there originally, the grass that was all the way down to the lake, was killed using a herbicide treatment. containing glyphosate, and then plants were brought in and it was planted. Notice one thing here is that the sod was not removed. So we left the sod in place, and what that does is it helps to protect the soil, because if you were to remove the sod, basically you're opening that ground up to expose the soil, and you can have some erosion happening. We left the sod in place here. We added some mulch and some plants. So this is very, very typical of what might occur in a situation where you're doing a total revegetation. The other thing you can do in some situations, if there is bare soil here or not much vegetation, is you can put seeds down. And I like to do that in a lot of cases. If I'm going to use seeds, then I'll probably use an erosion control fabric to put over the top of the seed and then plant plants on top of that. If you have a thick layer of mulch over seeds, it's going to be hard for those seeds to come through. So this is a couple of planting strategies that we've used in the past for simple revegetations along the shores. And this is what that site looked like 1 year after. This looks like a lot of the same species, but the thing was, and this is one species, this is blue vervain, a lot of this is, and that's one of the plants that first comes up. But after a few years, then more diversity of the plants that we planted. It's just like planting a perennial garden. They come up and they take hold at different rates, but after a few years, it was equalized out more and they were able to compete with each other. And this last slide on shoreline buffers is a slide, a planting I did up near Outing, Minnesota. And this can show that there's quite a bit of diversity in this particular site and how beautiful a shoreline buffer can be. There's a lot of color in this site, and it's right on the highway, and Highway 6 as you go up into Outing. And even though I don't get there very often, I hear a lot of good compliments about how this looks still, which is nice to hear. So the other thing we were going to look at today was rain gardens. And there's a lot of interest in both. And rain gardens can be important in two ways. They can help close to the shore. They could be part of the buffer area. Or they can be helping further back away from the shore. They might even be on the other side of the house, is where you can be putting a rain garden in. Other times rain gardens are called bioretention. Sometimes they're called in some places. We mostly call them rain gardens, though, in the typical residential areas. Basically, they're shallow depressions that hold stormwater, typically up to 3 days. Rain gardens aren't water gardens, so they don't hold water like this for long periods of time, or ponds. You can have a pond near or part of the feature, but you really need to think of it as a separate feature. So it's like you could do a rain garden in conjunction with a water garden, but really when you're planning them, you sort of need to think of them separately. They're not a solution for poorly drained areas either. Sometimes I'll have people ask me, well, I have an area in my backyard that's always wet. Is that a good place to put a rain garden? Well, probably not, for the reason that the idea behind rain gardens is to allow infiltration to happen. If you have an area that's always wet or soggy, then you might consider putting in some wetland plants and calling it a wetland. But it functions a little bit differently than what we're doing in a designed rain garden. And the thing about rain gardens is because we're not having the water stay there for long periods of time, it's not a mosquito breeding area. Typically, from what I've heard about mosquitoes, is they take 5 to 7 days to go through their cycle to hatch. And the idea behind rain gardens is to have that water infiltrate so you're not having standing water for long periods of time.